In the forgotten corner of a weathered mountain range, where the wind whispers secrets of those who came before, stands a cabin most would call abandoned. Its windows, cracked like the heart of its new occupant, filter sunlight into dusty patterns on the worn wooden floor. Clara Everfield arrived here with nothing but faded memories of rejection, a small knapsack of belongings, and a loyal retriever named Rusty. As winter's first snow begins to fall, she stares at the dilapidated structure roof, partially collapsed, door hanging by a single hinge, and sees not ruin, but possibility. Could the very place most people would turn away from become the sanctuary that finally heals a lifetime of abandonment? The tin box rested in Clara's calloused hands, its once bright surface now dulled by years of opening and closing. Inside lay a single photograph, edges frayed, colors faded, of a smiling couple holding a small child. Clara couldn't remember their faces without this image. She was 7 when they left her at the county fair, promising to return after getting snacks. As evening fell and lights dimmed, a security guard found her sitting alone by the carousel, still waiting. Rusty nudged her knee with his damp nose, pulling Clara back to the present. The cabin creaked around them as wind swept through gaps in the walls. She tucked the photo away, reaching to scratch behind Rusty's ears. "You and me against the world, eh, boy?" Clara had found Rusty 5 years ago at a shelter, scheduled for euthanasia the following morning. His golden fur was matted, ribs visible beneath, but his eyes held something Clara recognized, the quiet resignation of the unwanted. She signed the papers without hesitation. That night, on her apartment floor, Rusty had curled beside her during one of her episodes. The panic that usually squeezed her chest until she couldn't breathe somehow eased with his warm weight against her side. They'd been inseparable since. The office cubicle where Clara processed insurance claims had grown more suffocating with each passing year. Her supervisor's voice still rang in her ears. "Everfield, these numbers don't add up. Fix it by morning." Numbers. Always numbers, never people, never connection. When the real estate listing appeared in her late-night scrolling, "Remote mountain cabin needs TLC, priced to sell," something stirred within her. The listing showed only one blurry exterior shot, but it was enough. 3 weeks later, she'd surrendered her apartment keys, packed her modest belongings into her 15-year-old sedan, and headed north with Rusty riding shotgun. Clara hadn't expected quite this level of needs TLC. The real estate agent had met them at the base of the mountain, handed over keys with a skeptical glance, and departed with surprising haste. Now, as night settled in, Clara spread her sleeping bag atop a relatively clean patch of floor. The snow fell more heavily outside, dusting the windowsills that crept through broken glass. Rusty circled 3 times before settling against her back, his body heat more effective than the thin sleeping bag. The cabin held a strange stillness, different from her apartment's emptiness. This silence felt expectant rather than hollow. Through a gap in the roof, Clara glimpsed stars scattered across the night sky, brighter than she'd ever seen in the city. A memory surfaced, one of the better foster homes, where Mrs. Kelman would sneak Clara onto the roof on clear nights. "See those stars," she'd whisper. "They're the same ones looking down on everyone you've ever loved. You're never really alone under them." Clara had been moved to another home 2 months later. She never saw Mrs. Kelman again. Rusty's steady breathing beside her formed a rhythm, like waves on a shore. Clara synced her own breath to his, a technique that sometimes helped quiet her mind. Tomorrow would bring tasks, assessing damage, prioritizing repairs, finding the well Walter had mentioned should be on the property. For tonight, she allowed herself to simply exist in this broken space that was now hers. Her savings, carefully accumulated over years of frugal living, had been just enough to purchase this property outright. No mortgage, no landlord, no one to answer to. For the first time, Clara owned something that couldn't be taken away. The thought both terrified and exhilarated her. As sleep finally approached, Clara's hand rested on Rusty's flank, feeling his heartbeat. Outside, the snow continued falling, covering their tracks from the day, leaving only the path forward to consider. When morning came, morning light filtered through the cracked windows, casting long shadows across the worn floorboards. Clara stretched, her muscles protesting after a night on the hard floor. Beside her, Rusty was already alert, tail thumping against the wooden planks in anticipation of exploration. Clara reached for her notebook, a simple lined pad she'd purchased at the last gas station before the mountain turnoff. On the first page, she wrote in neat, precise letters, inventory and assessment. Below, she began her list. Roof, multiple leak, partial collapse, in nebula corner. Windows, 4 broken, 2 intact, but warped. Door, hanging by one hinge, doesn't close properly. Floor, surprisingly solid. Some boards need replacing. Walls, structurally sound. Insulation non-existent. Rusty whined softly by the door, his request unmistakable. Clara pulled on her boots and jacket, then followed him outside. The morning air bit at her cheeks, crisp and clean in a way city air never managed. Snow had dusted everything overnight, transforming the disrepair into something almost magical. Footprints, not human, crisscrossed the clearing. Deer, perhaps, or foxes. The property extended farther than she'd been able to see in yesterday's fading light. Behind the cabin, an overgrown path led through tangled underbrush. Clara followed Rusty's excited bounds, pushing aside brambles that caught at her sleeves. The path opened into what had once been a garden, now wild with weeds and volunteer plants that had survived without human tending. "Well, well," Clara murmured, kneeling to examine the soil beneath the weeds. Rich and dark, not the rocky ground she'd expected. Potential. Rusty's bark drew her attention. He'd continued down the path and discovered a small stream, water gurgling beneath a thin sheet of ice at its edges. Clara followed, noting how the cabin had been strategically placed, sheltered by the mountain from northern winds, with access running water just a short walk away. Back inside, Clara added to her list. Atis garden space, overgrown but fertile. Water source, stream approximately 200 yards SE in wildlife, abundant. Tracks everywhere. Outbuilding, small shed, roof intact, door missing. In the corner cupboard, Clara discovered unexpected treasures. A stack of faded books on homesteading, a box of rusted tools, and a journal written in spidery handwriting dating back to the night. The previous owner, a man named Thomas, according to the journal, had recorded seasonal patterns, successful crops, and wildlife observations. Clara placed the journal carefully on the wobbly table, adding it to her inventory list, with a star beside it. Knowledge was survival up here. Systematically, she worked through the cabin's single room, measuring dimensions, testing what could be salvaged and what must be replaced. The stone fireplace seemed sound, though in desperate need of cleaning. The chimney, miraculously, appeared unblocked, a small mercy that meant warmth was possible. As the light shifted toward afternoon, Clara tacked the completed inventory list to the wall beside the door. 4 pages of meticulous notes and measurements, prioritized in order of urgency. Beside it, she pinned a crude drawing of the cabin's layout with planned improvements marked in red. Rusty settled by the fireplace, watching as Clara unpacked their supplies. Enough food for 2 weeks. Basic tools, the camping stove, and purification tablets for the stream water. Tomorrow she would begin with the roof and door. Shelter and security first, always. The enormity of the task ahead should have overwhelmed her. Instead, Clara felt a strange calm descend as she organized their temporary living space. Here, each problem had a tangible solution, unlike the hollow ache that had followed her from foster home to foster home. These challenges could be met with hammer and nail, with muscle and determination. From the front window, Clara watched the sun begin its early winter descent. For the first time in years, she was exactly where she had chosen to be. Not placed, not tolerated, not temporarily housed. The cabin might be broken, but it was hers to fix. Clara discovered the hammer beneath a rotting floorboard in what would become her bedroom corner. Unlike the rusted tools in the shed, this hammer retained a certain dignity, its wooden handle darkened by decades of palm oil, the head worn but solid. Whoever had owned it last had valued craftsmanship. The weight of it felt right in her hand, as though it had been waiting for her. "First things first," she told Rusty, who watched from his self-appointed post near the door. "We need to secure this place before nightfall." The door took priority. Clara removed it contillit, examining the warped wood and rusted hinges. With careful measurements and the application of the hammer's claw end, she managed to straighten the worst of the damage. By midday, the door hung properly, though gaps remained where the wood had shrunk. She stuffed these with strips of old clothing from her bag, temporary insulation until proper materials could be acquired. A family of sparrows had claimed the rafters, regarding Clara with suspicious eyes as she assessed the roof damage. "I'm not evicting you," she assured them, "just making repairs to our shared home." The northwestern corner would require complete rebuilding, but the remainder needed only patching. She gathered fallen branches from the nearby woods, splitting them into rough shingles with a hatchet found in the shed. Rusty proved an unexpected ally in the work. He retrieved fallen tools, barked when Clara wandered too close to a rotten board, and chased away the curious fox that came to investigate their activities. At midday, he led her to a sunny clearing, where wild berries still clung to frost-touched vines, a small, sweet gift from the mountain. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Clara tackled the broken windows, covering them with canvas from her camping gear. True glass would have to wait, but this would keep the worst of the elements at bay. Inside, she constructed a sleeping platform from salvaged wood, elevating their bedding from the drafty floor. The previous owner's journal mentioned a root cellar, which Clara located beneath a heavy trapdoor in the cabin floor. The space below was cool and dry, perfect for storing the potatoes and other staples she'd brought. Strings of dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, their fragrance faint but detectable. Remnants of a life interrupted, preserved in this underground pocket. A rusty kettle found new purpose on her camping stove, providing hot tea as Clara sketched plans by lamplight. The cabin revealed its secrets gradually, a hidden shelf behind loose boards, a carved message on a ceiling beam reading Margaret Thomas, 1972, nail holes indicating where pictures had once hung. Clara arranged her few possessions carefully, books stacked by the bed, the tin box with its precious photograph tucked into a secure nook. Her clothes hung on pegs she'd fashioned from sturdy branches, simple organization that transformed the space from abandoned to inhabited. When the last light faded, Clara stepped onto the rough-hewn front steps. Rusty at her side, the clearing around the cabin stood in stark contrast to the dense forest beyond. Stars emerged overhead, impossibly bright, while somewhere in the distance an owl called. The air carried the scent of pine and earth, and coming snow. For the first time since arriving, Clara felt her shoulders relax. The day's labor had quieted the restless thoughts that typically plagued her evenings. Her hands, now blistered and scraped, had accomplished tangible progress. Unlike the endless paperwork of her former job, here results were immediate and visible. Rusty leaned against her leg, his warm presence anchoring her to this moment, this place. Tomorrow would bring more work. The roof wasn't finished. The floor needed attention. The clearing required cleaning before true gardening could begin. But tonight, watching the stars emerge above their imperfect shelter, Clara felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not happiness exactly, not yet, but perhaps its foundation, the quiet satisfaction of claiming space in a world that had never made room for her before. The storm arrived without warning. One moment, Clara was hauling water from the stream. The next, she was fighting through blinding snow just to find the cabin again. If not for Rusty darting ahead, she might have wandered in the wrong direction entirely. By nightfall, Wind howled through the mountains with a voice that seemed almost human in its fury. "We'll be fine," Clara told Rusty, though the dog's raised hackles suggested he knew better. The patches on the northwestern corner of the roof, temporary measures meant to last until spring, buckled under the accumulating snow. At midnight, with a crack that jolted Clara from uneasy sleep, a section gave way entirely. Snow poured through the new opening, along with a blast of Arctic air that extinguished the small fire she'd managed to build in the hearth. Rusty barked frantically, circling the growing mound of snow on the cabin floor. "So much for my repairs," Clara muttered, pulling on every layer of clothing she owned. The emergency lantern cast long shadows as she dragged her bedding to the farthest corner from the breach. Rusty followed, pressing against her side as they huddled beneath every blanket and piece of spare clothing she possessed. The night stretched endlessly, punctuated by creaking timbers and the constant moan of wind. Clara's thoughts circled like the storm itself. What madness had possessed her to come here? A woman with no experience in mountain living, no practical skills beyond insurance form processing, no one to call for help. Even the satellite phone she'd purchased for emergencies showed no signal in the storm. "If we survive until morning," she whispered into Rusty's fur, "we'll head down the mountain, find someplace sensible to live." Morning arrived with eerie silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed world. Clara pushed open the door, now frozen and requiring her full weight against it, to find the clearing buried under 3 feet of pristine snow. The damage to the roof gaped like an open wound against the brilliant blue sky. There would be no heading down the mountain today. The narrow access road would be impassable. Necessity overcame doubt. Clara dragged the small stepladder she'd found in the shed, positioning it beneath the roof breach. Wind had driven snow into every corner of the cabin, but the damage was surprisingly contained. The ceiling beams remained intact, only the makeshift shingles had failed. In the shed, Clara found a tarp among the previous owner's possessions. Stiff with age but still waterproof, it would serve until she could make proper repair. Climbing the ladder with numb fingers, she managed to secure the tarp over the opening, weighting it down with rocks gathered from the stream bed. By afternoon, she had cleared the worst of the snow from inside, restarted the fire, and assessed their situation. Food supplies remained adequate. Water was abundant, if frozen. The repaired roof held against the occasional gusts that swept down from higher elevations. Exhausted, Clara sank onto her bedding, still in the protected corner. Rusty settled beside her, his body heat more effective than the small fire. Through the patched roof, sunlight struck the opposite wall, creating prisms where it passed through the single intact window. The rainbow colors shimmered, shifting with the angle of the sun. Clara watched, transfixed, as the light transformed the humble space into something almost magical. Crystals of remaining snow caught the glow, sparkling like scattered diamonds across the rough floor. "Look at that, Rusty," she whispered. The dog raised his head, following her gaze to the light display. In that moment, Clara recognized something unexpected within herself. Not just survival. Anyone with enough desperation could survive, but a flicker of determination that felt surprisingly like strength. She had faced the mountain's first test and remained standing. Outside, the snow-covered landscape stretched pristine and untouched, beautiful in its severity. The trees, laden with white, bent without breaking. The stream, partially frozen, still found paths to flow beneath the ice. Nothing here surrendered to the harshness. Everything adapted. Clara ran her hand along the newly patched roof, her own adaptation, imperfect, temporary, but holding, like her, like this first fragile claim on belonging. The crunch of footsteps on snow froze Clara mid-motion as she stacked firewood against the cabin's eastern wall. Rusty's ears perked, his body tensing beside her. In 3 months on the mountain, they'd seen deer, foxes, even a black bear lumbering through the distant trees, but no humans. "Hello there," the voice, weathered but strong, carried clearly across the clearing. Clara reached for the hatchet, tucked in her belt, keeping it hidden against her leg. Rusty surprisingly didn't growl, but watched with tilted head as the figure emerged from the tree line. He was older than Clara had initially thought, perhaps 70, with a silver beard reaching halfway down his chest. Snowshoes strapped to his boots explained how he'd navigated the deep drifts. A well-worn pack rode high on his shoulders, and he carried a walking stick notched with what appeared to be trail markers. "Don't get many folks up here," he called, stopping a respectful distance away, "especially not in February." "That's the point," Clara answered, not relaxing her grip on the hatchet. "How did you know I was here?" The man gestured toward the cabin. "Smoke. Been watching it for weeks now. Figured I'd wait until you got settled before introducing myself." He patted the pack, brought some supplies, things newcomers usually forget. Rusty broke the standoff, trotting forward to sniff the stranger's outstretched hand. After a thorough inspection, he wagged his tail, a judgment Clara had learned to trust. "Walter Hammond," the man said, still not moving closer until invited. "Got a cabin about 4 miles northwest of here. Been on this mountain 43 years come April." Clara relaxed slightly. "Clara Everfield. And that traitor is Rusty." Walter smiled, creases deepening around his eyes. "Smart dog. Good judge of character." He glanced at the patched roof. "Recent storm gave you trouble. Nothing I couldn't handle." "I can see that." There was genuine respect in his tone. "Mind if I come in? Got coffee in my thermos." Clara hesitated, then nodded. Privacy had become sacred, but information, especially from someone who knew this mountain, might prove invaluable. Inside, Walter moved with the careful respect of someone entering another's territory. He asked permission before sitting, declined Clara's offer to take his coat, and made no comment about the cabin's sparse accommodations. Instead, he unloaded his pack, a thermos of hot soup, coffee, fresh bread wrapped in cloth, and a jar of honey. "From my bees," he explained, setting the honey aside. "Best in the county, if you don't mind my saying." They ate in silence for several minutes, the soup warming Clara from within. It was the first food she hadn't prepared herself in months, rich with vegetables and herbs she couldn't identify. "Thomas Wilcox built this place," Walter said, eventually, glancing at the ceiling beams. "Back in '69. Good man. Kept to himself mostly, but knew how to be a neighbor when needed." "You knew him?" Clara's interest piqued. "Everyone knew everyone back then. Fewer of us up here. Thomas trapped, mostly. Wife Margaret tended the best garden on the mountain." Walter's gaze moved to the window overlooking the overgrown garden plot. "Berries you wouldn't believe. Shared with everyone." "What happened to them?" "Margaret took sick winter of '89. Cancer. Thomas nursed her right here, then couldn't bear staying after she passed. Moved to his daughter's place in Oregon." Walter sipped his coffee. "Place has been empty since, until you." Clara absorbed this, strangely comforted, knowing the cabin had witnessed both love and loss before her arrival. "Why hasn't anyone else claimed it?" "Mountain life isn't for most folks. Too hard, too lonely." Walter studied her face. "Yet here you are, doing just fine." Clara almost laughed. "I wouldn't say fine. Roof's patched. You're warm, got food and water." Walter shrugged. "In these parts, that's the definition of fine." As the light faded, Walter repacked his thermos, but left the remaining supplies. "I come this way every couple weeks. Check traps, collect sap when the season's right." He paused at the door. "No obligation to welcome company. Mountain teaches self-reliance, but no shame in accepting help either." Clara watched from the window as he disappeared into the trees, his form gradually fading into the gathering dusk. Rusty whined softly beside her, as though missing the visitor already. The soup container remained on the table, steam still rising from its contents. A small kindness, freely given. Clara hadn't realized how hungry she'd been for human contact, until it was offered without demands or expectation. "You've been staring at these woods for months now," Walter said, spreading a sheet of weathered paper across a flat rock. Time you understood what you're looking at. 3 visits after their first meeting, Clara had come to anticipate Walter's arrival. He never came empty-handed, seeds for planting, tools she lacked, knowledge freely given. Today, he'd brought a pencil and blank paper. "We'll make you a proper map," he declared. Memory fails at the worst times. Together they sketched the contours of Clara's property, Walter guiding but insisting she draw herself. "Your hand needs to know the land," he explained. "Fingers remember what minds forget." The stream became a blue line winding across the page. The cabin, a small square near its center. Beyond Clara's immediate surroundings, Walter added features she'd never seen. A waterfall 2 miles north, a meadow thick with medicinal plants, the treacherous ravine to be avoided during spring thaws. "This ridge," he pointed to a line he'd drawn along the western boundary, "works like a weather vane. Clouds gather there first. See them building, you've got 8 hours before storm hits." Clara noted this on the map's margin, the practical knowledge more valuable than gold. And here Walter indicated a sloping area southeast of the cabin. "Wild onions come up first, spring sign. Follow with morels if you're patient. Then trout lilies, good eating if you know how to prepare them." Rusty watched their work from a sun-warmed patch of earth, occasionally rising to follow when they moved to verify sightlines or landmarks. The dog had taken to Walter completely, greeting him with enthusiasm. Clara once feared was reserved solely for her. "Your property extends to that lightning-struck pine," Walter said, pointing to a distant sentinel. "Beyond that belongs to the Harrisons, though they haven't been up in 15 years. Good people. Daughter had asthma, couldn't handle the altitude." Clara added the boundary to their map, surprised at how vast her holdings were. The modest sum she'd paid hardly reflected the treasure of this land. "What about here?" She indicated the area where Rusty often disappeared during their afternoon explorations. Walter's eyes crinkled. "Been saving that for last. Grab your basket." They followed a game trail. Clara had never noticed, Rusty leading confidently as if he'd always known the destination. 20 minutes of walking brought them to a hidden clearing where sunlight dappled through canopy gaps. "Old Cherokee knew this spot long before any of us," Walter said quietly. "See those stone arrangements? Not natural." In the clearing's center grew a circle of plants Clara didn't recognize, their glossy leaves distinct from the surrounding vegetation. "Ginseng," Walter said. "Worth more than gold to the right buyers. Thomas cultivated it, secret-like. Paid for Margaret's treatments with roots from this very patch." Clara knelt to examine the plants, careful not to disturb them, "and no one's harvested since they left. Mountain keeps its secret." Walter nodded approvingly at her gentle handling. "Plants need another year anyway. I check on them sometimes. Figured you should know they're here." When they returned to the cabin, Walter added the secret clearing to their map, with a small star, but no label. "Some things better not written down," he said, "but good for keeping here." He tapped his temple. They continued until the light faded, marking springs that ran year-round, caves where one could shelter in emergencies, and trees with the best sap for syrup-making. By dusk, Clara possessed a document worth more than any deed, a true reading of her land's character. "One last thing," Walter said, taking the pencil. In the map's corner he drew a small cabin icon northwest of Clara's. "That's me. Should you ever need anything," he hesitated, then added, "or just want company." Clara carefully folded the map, touched by its inclusion. More than directions, Walter had given her context, a place not just in the physical landscape, but in the human one as well. Her cabin was no longer an isolated point, but connected, however distantly, to another. That night, she hung the map beside her door, fingers tracing the path between the 2 small squares, representing human dwellings. 4 miles of wilderness separated them, Yet somehow the mountain felt less vast, less impersonal. Rusty settled at her feet, tired from the day's explorations but content. Outside an owl called, the same one that had greeted their arrival months ago, now a familiar voice in their growing vocabulary of mountain sounds. The last snow melted reluctantly, revealing earth that had slept undisturbed through winter's embrace. Clara knelt in the clearing that had once been Margaret's garden, fingers working the soil that still bore traces of careful cultivation decades earlier. Beneath the tangle of winter-killed weeds and volunteer saplings, she found remnants of orderly rows, stone borders, even a few hardy perennials struggling towards sunlight. "What do you think, Rusty? Can we bring it back?" The dog, more interested in a chipmunk's burrow than gardening prospects, glanced up briefly before returning to his investigation. Clara had spent late winter evenings studying the homesteading books left by Thomas and Margaret. Their margin notes offered insights into what thrived at this elevation, when to plant, how to extend the short growing season. Margaret had noted proudly, "Carrots lasted until January in the root cellar." Now armed with packets of seeds from Walter and determination born of winter confinement, Clara set to work, first removing rocks, then breaking compacted soil, carefully preserving the few surviving plants, chives emerging in a tight clump, mint spreading along one border, a gnarled raspberry cane showing improbable signs of life. By mid-morning she had cleared a modest section, perhaps 6 feet square, not much, but a beginning. She marked rows with twine salvaged from the shed, spaced according to Margaret's notation. Then, with reverence that surprised her, Clara opened the first seed packet, radishes, quick-growing and cold-tolerant. The routine developed naturally: rise with the sun, tend the newly exposed garden until late morning, then turn to cabin repairs during afternoon warmth. Clara replaced the temporary roof patch with proper shingles, installed a recycled window Walter had brought from town, and reinforced the porch that had sagged dangerously during winter thaws. Each evening she checked the garden for signs of growth, sometimes kneeling to whisper encouragement to the invisible seeds beneath the soil. Rusty would watch these one-sided conversations with head tilted, then nudge her hand, as if to say, "They'll come when they're ready." On the 14th day, Clara gasped. There, barely visible in the morning light, a single green shoot had broken through, the first radish announcing itself to the world. She knelt beside it, overcome by emotion disproportionate to this tiny accomplishment. Walter recalled, 2 days later, when his familiar figure appeared at the tree line. "Come see." He approached the garden plot with appropriate solemnity, bending carefully to examine the neat rows now showing multiple green sprouts. "Margaret would approve," he said simply, the highest praise he could offer. That afternoon they worked together installing the window frames Clara had prepared. Walter moved with the efficiency of experience, teaching without lecturing, correcting with demonstrations rather than criticism. By sunset, the cabin boasted 3 proper windows that opened to catch mountain breezes. "Makes a difference, doesn't it?" Walter stepped back to admire their work. "Place starts looking back at you differently when you care for it properly." Clara nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The cabin had ceased being simply shelter and had become something more, a home responding to her attentions, revealing its character gradually, as she revealed hers. Later, as they shared tea on the newly reinforced porch, Walter took a small notebook from his pocket. "Been meaning to give you this, for recording your observations." The journal was leather-bound and weathered, its pages creamy and thick. Inside the cover, Walter had written simply, "For Clara's mountain days. Started one myself. First spring here," he explained. "Helps notice patterns. When birds return. When last frost hits. When berries ripen. Memory plays tricks, but writing stays true." That night, after Walter departed and Rusty settled into his customary place by the hearth, Clara made her first entry in the journal. April 14. First radish appeared today. Planted by human hands but emerged of its own accord according to its own nature. Cabin windows now complete. Can see the garden from the kitchen. The mountain seems less imposing when viewed through glass. I installed myself. Strange how accomplishing small things makes larger things seem possible. She hesitated, then added, Walter says Margaret grew flowers among her vegetables. Beauty matters, even in practical things. Tomorrow, we'll plant the sunflower seeds along the garden's edge. Before sleeping, Clara stood in the doorway, watching moonlight transform the clearing. The repaired roof no longer admitted rain. The new windows reflected stars. The tiny seedlings slept beneath dark soil, gathering strength for tomorrow's growth. The transformation wasn't complete, might never be, but progress had a momentum of its own now, carrying her forward day by day, small victory by small victory. You can't hide on this mountain forever, Walter said, examining the jars of wild raspberry jam cooling on Clara's windowsill. Besides, you could get twice the supplies for these at the market than what you'd pay at Jennings' store. Clara had avoided the trip into town since her arrival 6 months ago. The general store at the mountain's base, run by a taciturn man named Jennings, provided necessities when Walter couldn't bring them. The thought of crowds of curious eyes and inevitable questions made her stomach tighten. I don't know, Walter. Market's this Saturday. Not many folks, just locals. Good people, mostly. He tapped one of the jam jars, and this is too good to keep to yourself. The jam had been an experiment. Wild berries from the clearing Walter had shown her, prepared according to Margaret's notes, sweetened with the last of Clara's sugar. The ruby color caught morning light, transforming ordinary glass into something jewel-like. Will Rusty be welcome? She asked. Finding her excuse, Walter chuckled. Half the vendors bring their dogs. He'll fit right in. By Saturday, Clara had talked herself into and out of going a dozen times. The final decision came at dawn, when she looked at her dwindling supplies and the neat row of jam jars. Practicality won over fear. The drive down the mountain road felt strange after months of isolation. Clara gripped the steering wheel too tightly, while Rusty pressed his nose against the passenger window, cataloguing new scents. The town of Pinecrest appeared suddenly around a bend, smaller than Clara remembered, barely more than a main street with scattered buildings. The farmers' market occupied the town square, perhaps 20 stalls arranged in a rough circle. Walter waited at the entrance, his weathered truck already unloaded, a table of honey jars and handcrafted wooden items on display. You came, he said, genuine pleasure in his voice. Let's find you a spot. Clara set up her modest offering, 12 jars of jam, some dried herbs from her garden, and bundles of kindling she'd tied with twine. Around her, other vendors arranged vegetables, baked goods, handcrafts, and items. Clara couldn't immediately identify. A woman at the neighboring stall nodded politely, then returned to arranging quilted potholders. The first customer approached Walter's stall, not Clara's. Then another. Clara watched their interactions, the easy conversation, the exchange of news along with goods. When someone finally paused at her table, she felt her throat constrict. These your jams. The woman was perhaps 60, with silver-streaked hair pulled into a practical bun. She lifted one jar, examining it against the light. Wild raspberry. Clara nodded. From the old Wilcox place, I'd guess. Margaret always said those high mountain berries had the best flavor. The woman set the jar down. I'll take 2. $6 each, fair. Clara hadn't considered pricing. Yes, that's fine. The woman counted out bills, then hesitated. You're the one who moved into Thomas and Margaret's cabin, aren't you? Yes, I'm Clara. Grace Hoffman. Taught school here 40 years. She studied Clara's face. Bold move, taking on that place alone. Before Clara could respond, Grace added, Margaret was a friend. Good woman. She'd be pleased someone's tending her garden again. Throughout the morning, similar exchanges repeated. People approached cautiously, examined her goods, then inevitably asked about the cabin. Some remembered Thomas and Margaret fondly. Others seemed merely curious about the newcomer. A few eyed her with undisguised suspicion. "Don't mind the Turners," Walter murmured when one couple walked away after a particularly cool interaction. "They wanted that property for years, thought it would go for taxes eventually." By noon, Clara had sold all her jam and most of the herbs. The cash box contained more money than she'd expected, enough for supplies and a small luxury or two. More valuable than the money, however, was the knowledge she'd gained. Sarah Jenkins knew which seeds thrived best in the mountain soil. Old man Peterson identified the mysterious plant growing beside Clara's porch as valuable golden seal. Becca Donovan offered canning jars in exchange for more herbs when they matured. "Not so bad, was it?" Walter asked as they loaded Clara's remaining items into her car. Clara considered the question honestly. "Different than I expected." "How so? I thought they'd see me as an outsider." But they mostly wanted to talk about Thomas and Margaret. About the land. She glanced around the now familiar market. "It's like I'm being measured against something they valued, not against some standard I can't meet." Walter nodded. "Mountain people judge by different yardsticks. Can you weather winter? Do you respect what came before? Will you contribute something worthwhile?" He closed her trunk. "You're doing fine on all counts." Driving home, Clara felt subtly altered. The jam jar in her passenger seat, a gift from Grace Hoffman, filled with preserved peaches, represented something beyond simple exchange. It was acknowledgement, however tentative, of her place in this community's fabric. Midsummer transformed the mountain. Clara's garden exploded with life. Rows of vegetables stretching toward the sun, berry canes heavy with fruit, herbs releasing fragrance with each passing breeze. What had begun as a modest plot now sprawled across the clearing, reclaiming the full extent of Margaret's original design. Clara moved between the rows, harvest basket over her arm. Morning light gilded everything, the dew-damp leaves, Rusty's fur as he trotted alongside her, the weathered wood of the cabin that no longer looked abandoned, but well-loved. She gathered beans, summer squash, early potatoes dug from the rich soil, adding each to her increasingly heavy basket. "We did it, boy," she told Rusty, who responded by stealing a fallen bean pod and crunching it between his teeth. "More than enough for us, with plenty to preserve for winter." Grace Hoffman had become Clara's tutor in the art of preservation. The elderly woman visited weekly, bringing knowledge accumulated over decades of mountain living. Together they had filled the root cellar with jars of pickled vegetables, jams, and preserved fruit. "Your hands are learning," Grace observed during their last session, watching Clara efficiently pack beans into sterilized eyes. "Memory in the muscles, that's what my mother called it." Clara examined her hands, tanned now, with calluses and small scars marking months of labor. Nails kept practical, short. A far cry from the soft, pale hands that had once typed insurance forms in a cubicle. These hands could build, grow, create, sustain. The garden provided more than food. It offered structure to Clara's days, purpose to her actions, visible results from her efforts. She had learned to read subtle signs, which plants needed more water, which insects were beneficial, how the slope of the land affected growth patterns. Knowledge acquired not from books, but from patient observation and occasional failures. Beyond the garden, Clara's transformation of the cabin continued. The roof, completely rebuilt now, no longer admitted even the most determined rainstorm. Windows gleamed, each frame hand-sanded and sealed. Inside she had plastered walls, refinished floors, and built simple furniture from salvaged wood under Walter's occasional guidance. "You've got a good eye," he'd commented when she completed a set of shelves that followed the natural contours of the cabin's walls. "Seeing what wants to be there, not forcing your own ideas on the space." Clara hadn't thought of it that way, but recognized the truth in his words. She wasn't imposing her will on the cabin so much as restoring its inherent character, helping it become what it had always had the potential to be. In late afternoon, when the day's heat reached its peak, Clara, and Rusty retreated to the stream. She had built a small dam of stones, creating a pool deep enough to soak in. The water remained bracingly cold even in summer, a pleasant shock to the system that left her refreshed and alert. Rusty splashed alongside her, chasing minnows and occasionally barking at his own reflection. His coat had grown thick and healthy, his body strong from daily explorations. Like Clara, he had found his element in this mountain life. Back at the cabin, Clara prepared a simple dinner from the day's harvest: new potatoes roasted with fresh herbs, steamed greens, and the last of a trout Walter had brought earlier in the week. She ate on the porch, watching twilight settle over the valley below. From this vantage point, she could see the distant lights of Pinecrest appearing as darkness gathered. After dinner came her newest ritual. Clara took the leather-bound journal Walter had given her and settled into the porch swing she'd built in early summer. By lantern light, she recorded the day's activities, observations about plant growth, weather patterns, wildlife sightings. She sketched new flowers she discovered, noted when birds nested or departed. The journal entries, begun as practical records, had evolved into something more personal. Between notes on rainfall and germination times, Clara found herself recording moments of beauty: a particularly vivid sunset, the pattern of shadows on the cabin floor, the way Rusty's eyes reflected firelight in the evening. Tonight, she added a self-observation: my body is changing with the work. Arms stronger, skin weathered, but healthy in a way I've never been. I catch glimpses of myself in the window glass, and sometimes don't recognize the woman looking back, not because she appears worse, but because she appears more fully herself. As if the extraneous parts have been worn away, leaving what matters. She closed the journal as full darkness settled. Tomorrow would bring more harvesting, more preserving. The cycle of growth and preparation continued, each day building toward the winter that would inevitably return. But unlike her first winter on the mountain, the next would find Clara prepared, provisioned, and rooted in this place she now confidently called home. Walter arrived unannounced on a Tuesday, his truck kicking up dust along the narrow access road. Clara noticed immediately that something was wrong. His customary wave was absent, his shoulders rigid beneath his faded flannel shirt. Rusty sensed it too, meeting the old man with subdued greeting, rather than his usual enthusiasm. "We need to talk," Walter said, declining Clara's offer of coffee. He spread a newspaper across her kitchen table, pointing to a small article circled in red. County approved the rezoning application. Mountain View Development got their permit. Clara scanned the article, understanding dawning slowly. They're building here, on the mountain? Not just building, planning a whole resort complex, luxury cabins, shopping, even talk of a gondola. Walter's weathered finger traced the map accompanying the article. Their property borders yours to the south. But they won't stop there. Clara studied the property lines indicated on the map. "How do you know?" "Been watching them operate in other counties. They start small, then pressure surrounding landowners to sell. Those who refuse find themselves dealing with suddenly strict enforcement of obscure regulations, water rights challenges, access road disputes." Clara sat heavily in her chair, the newspaper blurring before her. "They can't force us to sell, can they?" Walter's silence was answer enough. "How many properties are affected?" 12 independent holdings on this section of the mountain. Mine. Yours. The Petersons, Grace Hoffman's family plot. Others. Walter pulled another document from his jacket, older, with official seals. "You should have this." Clara unfolded the paper carefully. A property deed, yellowed with age but clearly stating her ownership of 43 acres, with easements and water rights carefully delineated. "Thomas gave me this for safekeeping when he left," Walter explained. "Said to pass it to whoever next loved the land properly. Figured now's the time you might need it." Clara ran her finger over Thomas Wilcox's signature at the bottom of the page. A connection to the past, and perhaps protection for the future. "What can we do?" she asked. Community meeting tomorrow night at the Grange Hall. 7 o'clock. Walter finally accepted a cup of coffee, wrapping his gnarled hands around the warm mug. You should come. Clara hesitated. She'd integrated into the community gradually over recent months, selling at the market, exchanging preserves and seeds with neighbors, even attending the midsummer festival in town. But she still valued her privacy, her quiet existence apart from group concerns. Why me? I'm the newest resident, barely been here a year. Walter studied her face. You've got education the rest of us don't. Can read legal documents, understand corporate tactics. Before you came here, you lived in their world. Clara couldn't deny the logic, though the thought of her previous life as an asset rather than something to escape felt strange. Besides, Walter added more gently, you've got as much to lose as any of us, maybe more. This place saved you somehow, didn't it? Clara glanced around the cabin, her home, transformed by months of labor and care. Through the window, she could see her thriving garden, the repaired shed, the herb drying racks she'd built last month. Beyond lay the forest she'd come to know intimately, the stream that provided water, the clearings where she and Rusty spent peaceful afternoons. I'll be there, she said finally. After Walter left, Clara took the deed and walked her property line, Rusty trotting beside her. She studied each marker stone, each boundary tree noted in the document. The southern border, shared with what would now be development land, followed a natural ridge for most of its length. At the highest point, Clara stopped, gazing down at what would soon be construction sites. The mountain had seemed so vast when she arrived, an endless wilderness that would remain untouched by the world she'd left behind. The illusion of separation now shattered, leaving her with difficult choices. That evening, Clara retrieved her laptop from storage, unused since her arrival on the mountain. The battery long dead, she connected it to the small solar setup Walter had helped her install in spring. As it powered on, she felt as though she were opening a door to her previous life, one she'd deliberately closed behind her. Her fingers, now accustomed to garden tools and building projects, felt clumsy on the keyboard, but muscle memory remained as she began researching Mountain View development, their previous projects, and the tactics Walter had described. By midnight, she had filled a notebook with information, strategies and questions to raise at tomorrow's meeting. Clara finally stepped onto her porch, seeking the night air's clarity. Stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human concerns. The mountain breathed around her, ancient, patient, but suddenly vulnerable in ways she hadn't considered before. We'll figure this out, she whispered, as much tattoo as to the land that had become her sanctuary. Ms. Everfield, Brad Mitchell, Mountain View Development. The man extending his hand across Clara's porch railing wore hiking boots that had never seen a trail, paired with pressed khakis and a company logo fleece. Behind him, a woman in similar attire studied a tablet, occasionally glancing up to survey the property. A gleaming SUV idled in the clearing, its city license plate marking them as outsiders. Clara didn't invite them in. How did you find me? County records. Mitchell's smile revealed perfect teeth. Beautiful property you have here. Quite the transformation from when you purchased it, according to our research. The calculated familiarity set Clara on edge. Rusty appeared from around the cabin, positioning himself between Clara and the visitors. He didn't growl, but his usually wagging tail remained still. What do you want, Mr. Mitchell? Just a friendly conversation about opportunities. He gestured, expansively. Our Clearwater Ridge project is going to transform this area. Property values will skyrocket. Infrastructure improvements. Year-round tourism economy. The woman stepped forward. We're prepared to make a generous offer for your parcel, well above market value. She named a figure that momentarily stole Clara's breath. Enough to start over anywhere with considerable security. I'm not interested in selling, Clara said simply. Mitchell's smile remained, but his eyes cooled. I understand your attachment to the property. The improvements you've made are impressive for he hesitated, solo woman. But I urge you to consider the realities. Realities. Development is coming, Ms. Everfield. The county commissioners have already approved rezoning. Phase 1 construction begins next month. The woman handed Clara a glossy brochure. Our initial build includes upgrading the main access road. Heavy equipment, significant traffic for at least 18 months. Not ideal for someone seeking isolation. Clara studied the brochure. Artist renderings of luxury cabins with floor-to-ceiling windows, a central lodge with sweeping views, manicured hiking trails. Nothing like the wild, authentic mountain she'd come to love. And after construction, Clara asked, 400 new residences within 3 years, Mitchell answered, mistaking her question for interest. The mountain economy will completely transform. Quaint is charming, but progress is inevitable. Clara folded the brochure, handing it back. My answer is still no. Mitchell's demeanor shifted subtly. I should mention that our environmental engineers have concerns about several local properties, including yours. Wastewater management issues, potential watershed contamination. The county will need to investigate, of course. The threat hung in the air between them. Clara felt heat rising in her chest. Not fear, but unexpected anger. This mountain, her home, the community that had gradually accepted her, all viewed as obstacles to be removed. Is there anything else? Clara asked, her voice steady. Mitchell handed her a business card. Think it over. Our initial offer stands for 30 days. After that, he shrugged, glancing meaningfully at her carefully tended garden, the repaired cabin, the life she'd built. Clara watched their SUV disappear down the access road, dust settling in its wake. Inside the cabin, she unfolded the community petition she'd been tasked with drafting after the Grange Hall meeting. 23 signatures so far, nearly every independent property owner on the mountain. A statement of unified opposition to the development, citing environmental concerns, historical preservation, and indigenous heritage sites discovered on Peterson's property. The petition had felt like a small gesture before Mitchell's visit. Now it seemed woefully inadequate against the machinery already in motion. That evening, Clara drove to Grace Hoffman's house at the mountain's eastern edge. The gathering in Grace's living room had a wartime atmosphere, maps spread across tables, property documents examined, strategies debated. Clara recognized faces from the farmer's market, alongside others she'd only heard mentioned. They came to your place already? Old Peterson whistled low when Clara recounted her visitors. Moving faster than we thought, threatened me with environmental violation, implied the county would investigate. Grace snorted. County inspector is Jim Brannigan. Went to school with my son. They're fishing. Hoping you'll panic. Walter spread a topographical map across the coffee table. Clara, show us exactly where your southern boundary runs. As Clara traced the property line, the group leaned forward collectively. That ridge forms a natural watershed, Peterson observed. Any development below risks contaminating the entire valley's water supply. Clara hadn't considered this angle. Would environmental protection laws apply? If we can prove endangerment to protected species, maybe. Walter looked thoughtful. Remember those wildflowers on your east slope? The purple ones with spotted leaves? Clara nodded. They're all over that section. I was planning to transplant some closer to the cabin. Don't touch them, Grace interrupted sharply. Those are mountain ladies' slippers, endangered in 3 states, including ours. A ripple of excitement moved through the room. We need documentation, someone said. Photographs, GPS locations, expert verification. Clara found herself volunteering. I can map the locations. My field guide identifies them as rare, but I didn't realize they were protected. As the meeting continued, Clara felt a shift in her relationship to the group, no longer the newcomer being gradually accepted, but a central figure with valuable knowledge and resources. Her property, with its strategic location and rare plant species, might become crucial to their collective defense. When she finally headed home, the night sky stretched vast above her car. Clara, rolled down the window, letting mountain air fill her lungs. The land that had once been her escape had now become something she would fight for, not just for herself, but for all it represented. 3 days had passed since Walter's scheduled visit, and still no sign of him. Clara paced her porch, watching the access road with growing concern. In 14 months of mountain living, Walter had never missed an arranged meeting. His reliability was as fundamental as the seasons. "Something's wrong, Rusty," she murmured. The dog whined softly, sensing her unease. Decision made, Clara gathered essentials into her backpack. Using the map Walter had helped her create, she traced the route to his cabin, a 4-mile journey through terrain she knew only from his descriptions. With Rusty leading, they set off before noon, following game trails that gradually aligned with the path marked on her map. Walter's cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, similar to hers in construction, but bearing the imprint of 40 years' habitation. Smoke should have risen from the chimney in the cool autumn air. Instead, an unnatural stillness surrounded the place. "Walter," Clara called, approaching cautiously. No answer came. The cabin door stood unlocked but closed. Clara knocked, waited, then entered when silence persisted. Inside, everything appeared in order. Dishes washed, bed made, Walter's journal open on the table beside a cold cup of coffee. The walking stick he carried on every journey remained propped beside the door. A single sheet of paper lay beside the journal, weighted down with a smooth river stone. Clara recognized Grace Hoffman's handwriting. "Walter, Jim called from County Hospital. Took you in this morning after finding you on the North Trail. Probable heart attack. They're stabilizing you for transfer to regional. I'm headed there now. Rest, you stubborn man." Grace. The note was dated 3 days earlier. Clara's mind raced. The county hospital lay 30 miles away in Pinecrest. Regional, where Walter would have been transferred for advanced care, was another 70 miles beyond, in the city Clara had left behind. With Rusty safely secured at Walter's cabin with food and water, Clara drove faster than wisdom dictated down the mountain road. The county hospital's small emergency department directed her onward to Regional Medical Center, confirming Walter's transfer 2 days prior. The city's noise and congestion assaulted Clara's senses as she navigated streets once familiar, but now disconcertingly alien. Concrete and glass towered where she expected trees and sky. Crowds moved with purpose that seemed both frantic and meaningless after her months of mountain solitude. At the hospital, a sympathetic nurse directed Clara to the cardiac unit. "Hammond, Walter. Room 417. His daughter's been here since yesterday." Daughter? Clara hadn't known Walter had family nearby. Grace Hoffman sat beside Walter's bed, her usually immaculate appearance rumpled from what appeared to be an overnight vigil. She looked up at Clara's entrance, relief washing over her tired features. "Thank God you came. He's been asking for you." Walter lay unnervingly still among monitoring equipment and IV lines. His robust frame seemed diminished, his weathered face pale beneath his silver beard. But his eyes, when they opened at Clara's approach, retained their characteristic sharpness. "Not how I planned to get you back to civilization," he managed, his voice weaker than she'd ever heard it. Clara took his hand, surprised by its uncharacteristic coolness. What happened? Foolishness happened, ignored the warning signs. Walter gestured weakly at his chest. "Turns out even mountain men need functioning hearts," Grace snorted. 3 blockages. Would have been gone if Jim Brannigan hadn't found him collapsed on the trail. The doctor's later explanation confirmed Grace's assessment. Triple bypass surgery scheduled for morning. Good prognosis given Walter's otherwise excellent physical condition, but recovery would be lengthy. No returning to an isolated cabin for months, possibly longer. "You'll stay with me," Grace informed Walter, in a tone that brooked no argument. "Spare rooms already made up." Clara remained at the hospital through the evening, listening as Walter and Grace shared stories from decades of mountain life. She learned Walter had been the first to welcome Grace when she'd returned to her family's mountain property after her husband's death 12 years earlier. That Grace's children had grown up spending summers on the mountain under Walter's watchful eye. That Walter had no biological children, but had unofficially adopted half the mountain's residents over the years. "The meeting next week," Walter said suddenly, focusing on Clara. "County Commissioner's final hearing on the zoning appeal." "Don't worry about that now," Grace soothed. "Have to worry." Walter's grip on Clara's hand tightened. "You'll need to speak for us. You know the legal angles, the environmental concerns. You've documented the lady's slippers better than anyone." Clara started to protest, but something in Walter's expression stopped her. Fear, not for himself, but for the mountain. Their mountain. "You've got the education," he continued, "and you've got the heart for it too, though you might not know it yet. These developers, they see people like me and figure us for backwards old-timers. But they'll understand what you're saying." As visiting hours ended, Clara stood reluctantly to leave. Walter reached for the small table beside his bed, fumbling, until Grace helped him retrieve his walking stick, the one she'd seen beside his door that morning. "Take it," he said, pressing the smooth wood into her hands. "Been up and down that mountain more times than I can count. Knows the way better than I do sometimes." The simple tool felt heavy with significance as Clara accepted it. Not a permanent transfer of ownership, she told herself. Just temporary safekeeping until Walter returned to his rightful place on the mountain. In the parking lot, Clara paused before starting her car, the walking stick secured carefully in the passenger seat. The hospital's illuminated windows glowed. Against the night sky, each light representing lives in transition, healing, ending, beginning. Walter's among them, his future suddenly uncertain. The Grange Hall, once a simple community gathering space, had transformed into a war room. Maps covered the walls, property documents spread across tables, and computer printouts detailed county zoning regulations. Clara stood at the front, Walter's walking stick propped against her chair, facing 24 determined mountain residents. "The commissioner's hearing is Tuesday," she said, indicating the date circled on the wall calendar. "We have 5 days to organize our approach." Clara moved with a confidence that would have astonished her former self. Months of physical labor had changed her body. Weeks of advocacy had transformed her presence. She spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had found her purpose. "Grace will present the historical preservation angle," Clara continued. "The Peterson property includes 3 sites identified by the university's anthropology department as having indigenous significance." Old Peterson nodded solemnly, clutching a folder containing the preliminary archaeological survey. "Sarah and Jim will address water quality concerns." Clara indicated the couple who operated the organic farm on the eastern slope. "They've documented baseline data for the watershed for 15 years. Clara unfolded a large map across the central table. "Most importantly, we've confirmed 3 separate populations of mountain ladies' slippers on properties that would be directly impacted by development. 2 on my land, 1 on the Harrison property." "The environmental consultant arrives tomorrow," Grace added. "State universities sending their top botanist to verify and document." Clara's journey from solitary newcomer to community organizer had happened gradually, then suddenly, accelerated by Walter's absence. His surgery had been successful, but recovery progressed slowly, keeping him at Grace's home in town rather than his beloved cabin. "What about legal standing?" asked Tim Reynolds, whose family had owned mountain property for 4 generations. "These developers have high-priced attorneys." "We've got something better," Clara replied, opening her notebook where neat handwriting detailed their strategy. "Public opinion and environmental law." She clicked a button on her laptop, projecting an email onto the wall screen. The Regional Environmental Coalition has agreed to support our petition. They're bringing their legal team to the hearing. A ripple of excited conversation moved through the room. Clara allowed it to continue for a moment before continuing. But we need more than outside support. We need every one of you there, with your stories, your knowledge, your connection to this mountain. After the formal meeting adjourned, Clara remained behind with Grace and a few core members, finalizing details. She'd fallen naturally into the role of record keeper, her precise handwriting filling pages with assigned tasks, speaking points, and contingency plans. "Walter would be proud," Grace said, watching Clara carefully organize her notes. "Though not surprised, I suspect. He saw something in you from the beginning." Clara glanced at the walking stick beside her chair. "I'm just the newest voice. You all have generations invested here. Sometimes fresh eyes see clearest," Grace replied. "You bridge worlds. You understand both what we're protecting and what we're protecting it from." Back at her cabin, Clara updated her journal by lantern light, Rusty dozing beside her. Beyond documentation of ladies' slippers and water quality readings, she found herself writing a more personal entry. "I came to this mountain seeking solitude, believing connection was something I couldn't trust. Yet here I am, embedded in a web of relationships that sustain rather than deplete. These people aren't perfect. They argue, hold grudges, judge too quickly sometimes, but they understand what matters, the land beneath our feet, the work of our hands, the responsibility of stewardship." The following days blurred in constant motion. Clara drove the university botanist to documented plant sites, each population carefully photographed, measured, and logged with GPS coordinates. She visited Walter daily, bringing progress reports that brightened his eyes despite his physical weakness. She coordinated with the Environmental Coalition, translating their legal strategy into language the mountain community could rally behind. The developers hadn't remained idle. 2 more property owners reported visits from Mountain View representatives, with increased offers and thinly veiled threats. A glossy mailer circulated throughout the county, promoting job creation and economic growth. A consulting firm released a suspiciously favorable environmental impact report. 3 days before the hearing, Clara returned from town to find Rusty barking frantically at the cabin door. Inside, drawers stood open, papers scattered across the floor. Her laptop remained untouched on the table, but the environmental documentation, carefully organized in labeled folders, was missing. Clara stood amid the chaos, a cold certainty settling in her stomach. The battle had escalated beyond bureaucratic maneuvering. Fortunately, she'd anticipated potential interference, storing digital copies of all critical documents on encrypted drives held by multiple community members. That night, mountain residents gathered in Clara's cabin, a first, as she had always maintained her privacy, even while becoming more involved in community matters. They brought food, additional locks for her doors and windows, and a quiet determination that transformed from individual concern to collective resolve. As they departed, Tim Reynolds paused at the door. "You know, when you first arrived, some thought you wouldn't last a winter." Clara smiled slightly. "There were days I thought the same." "Not Walter," Tim replied. "He said you had mountain in your soul, just needed time to recognize it." He gestured to the gathering dispersing down the path. "Guess he was right about that too." The county commissioner's meeting room fell silent as the university botanist concluded her presentation. On the projection screen, a close-up photograph showed delicate purple and white ladies' slippers growing on Clara's property, their rarity and endangered status now officially documented. The environmental assessment submitted by Mountain View development failed to identify these populations, the botanist stated firmly. This oversight renders their impact study fundamentally incomplete. Clara sat in the front row beside Grace, watching the commissioners exchange glances. The local newspaper photographer captured the moment. his camera focusing alternately on the endangered flowers and the Mountain View representatives shifting uncomfortably in their seats. When Clara's turn came to address the commissioners, she approached the podium carrying Walter's walking stick, partly for moral support, partly as tangible connection to the man who should have been speaking in her place. Rusty, sporting an improvised mountain protector bandana, sat attentively beside Grace. "I moved to this mountain seeking solitude," Clara began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "What I found instead was a community with deep roots and profound wisdom. These people," she gestured to the mountain residents filling half the room, "aren't opposing progress out of stubbornness or fear of change. They're protecting something irreplaceable." Clara presented their case methodically: watershed concerns, indigenous heritage sites, endangered species habitat, and the intrinsic value of undeveloped wilderness. Her corporate background, once something she'd tried to escape, now served her well as she dismantled the developers' economic arguments with precise counterpoints. The commissioners voted to suspend development permits pending a comprehensive environmental review, a significant, if temporary, victory. As the crowd dispersed, the local reporter approached Clara for additional comments. "Would you mind if Rusty's in the photo?" he asked, kneeling to greet the friendly dog. People love animals with their local stories. The resulting article appeared the following day on the newspaper's front page. "Mountain woman and her dog lead fight against luxury development." The photograph showed Clara standing on her property's southern ridge, Rusty beside her, with the valley threatened by development spread below. In the background, her cabin stood as testament to harmonious integration with the landscape, the antithesis of the proposed resort complex. Clara pinned the newspaper clipping to her cabin wall with mixed emotions. The exposure felt uncomfortable after months of cherished privacy, but Walter had called from Grace's house with rare excitement after seeing the article. "Perfect timing," he'd said. "Public sentiment matters in these fights." 3 days after the hearing, Clara returned from checking her garden to find tire tracks cutting across her clearing. No vehicle waited, but the cabin door stood ajar. She was certain she'd locked it before leaving. Rusty growled low in his throat, the hair along his spine rising. "Stay," Clara commanded softly, approaching with caution. Inside, destruction awaited. Unlike the previous search, this wasn't a careful rifling through papers. This was rage made visible. Furniture overturned, jars of preserved food shattered across the floor, garden tools scattered. On the wall where her property deed had hung, red spray paint spelled "Sell or Else." Clara stood amid the chaos, a strange calm descending. This wasn't about documents anymore. This was intimidation, pure and simple. And she recognized something important. They wouldn't resort to such tactics if they weren't desperate. The mountain community responded with immediate solidarity. By nightfall, neighbors had helped clear the worst of the damage. Grace brought replacement preserves from her own pantry. Tim Reynolds and his sons repaired the doorframe and installed new locks. Old Peterson sat watch overnight with his hunting rifle across his knees. Despite Clara's protests, the incident transformed public opinion throughout the county. The newspaper ran follow-up coverage with photographs of the vandalism. The sheriff, previously neutral on the development issue, launched an investigation. Local businesses displayed "Protect Our Mountain" signs in windows previously adorned with Mountain View development promotional materials. Clara allowed herself one moment of breakdown when everyone had finally departed. Sitting on her porch steps in darkness, she buried her face against Rusty's neck and released the tears she'd held back all day. The dog remained perfectly still, offering silent comfort until the storm passed. When she finally raised her head, the stars overhead appeared impossibly bright. The same stars that had witnessed her arrival on this mountain, lost and seeking only escape. The same stars that now watched her stand her ground, rooted and resolute. Inside the cabin, Clara retrieved her journal from where it had been knocked beneath the table during the vandalism. Several pages were torn, the cover smudged with what looked like boot prints. Yet it remained intact, like her resolve. She opened to a fresh page and wrote a single sentence. "They don't understand that destroying what I've built only proves how desperately it needs protecting." The following morning brought unexpected news. The Environmental Coalition's attorneys had filed for an emergency injunction, using the documented vandalism as evidence of improper corporate conduct. By afternoon, a judge had granted a temporary halt to all Mountain View activities in the county. The first battle, it seemed, had gone to the mountain. Snow blanketed the mountain once more, transforming the landscape to pristine white. Clara stood on her porch, mug of steaming tea warming her hands, watching the first anniversary of her arrival approach with each falling flake. Rusty bounded through drifts, his golden fur collecting snow, his joy undiminished by the cold. The cabin behind her bore little resemblance to the broken structure she'd first encountered. Now sturdy and weather-tight, with smoke rising confidently from the chimney, windows glowing with warm light against the gathering dusk. Inside, shelves lined with preserved harvest from her garden promised sustenance through the coming months. The root cellar below contained potatoes, carrots, and apples stored in sand. Firewood stacked precisely against the eastern wall would last until spring, 1 year. The realization settled in Clara's chest, not with surprise, but with quiet acknowledgement. She had experienced the mountain's full cycle of seasons now, witnessed its transformations, and endured its challenges. The woman who had arrived seeking only escape had been transformed as thoroughly as the cabin itself. The legal injunction against Mountain View development remained in effect, reinforced by the state environmental agency's preliminary finding of significant ecological concerns requiring comprehensive study. The immediate threat had receded, though Clara harbored no illusions that the battle was permanently won. Corporate interests possessed resources and patience that individual citizens could rarely match. Yet something fundamental had shifted in the community's relationship to this fight. What began as separate property owners defending individual holdings had evolved into collective stewardship of the mountain itself. Weekly strategy meetings continued in the Grange Hall, focused now on long-term protection rather than immediate defense. Clara's role had evolved as well. Her documentation of endangered plant species had expanded into a comprehensive botanical survey of the mountain ecosystem, conducted in partnership with the university. Her cabin had become an impromptu field station where researchers occasionally stayed while collecting data that might further protect the region. The crunch of tires on snow-packed road drew Clara's attention. Walter's truck appeared around the bend, moving carefully through the fresh powder. Since his release from Grace's care last month, he had gradually resumed his mountain routines, though with concessions to his recovery. The walking stick remained with Clara by mutual agreement, a tangible reminder of their shared responsibility. "Perfect timing," Clara called as Walter emerged from his vehicle. "I was about to lose feeling in my fingers out here." Inside, Walter settled in what had become his chair near the fireplace. At his feet, Rusty collapsed with a contented sigh, head resting on Walter's boot. The cabin filled with the aroma of the venison stew Clara had prepared in anticipation of this visit, an anniversary dinner of sorts, though neither would name it as such. "Feels different, doesn't it?" Walter said, gazing around the cabin. "This storm compared to your first winter here," Clara nodded, stirring the stew. "Last year I was terrified when that roof section collapsed. Now I'm just grateful for all the repairs holding steady." "Wasn't talking about the cabin," Walter replied with a knowing smile. Clara understood. The difference lay within her. The confidence of experience, the security of belonging, the knowledge that she faced winter not as an adversary, but as a natural cycle to be respected and navigated. Their meal was interrupted by additional arrivals, Grace bearing fresh bread, Tim Reynolds and his wife carrying a cake decorated with a crude cabin drawing. Old Peterson with homemade moonshine for medicinal purposes only. Others followed until Clara's modest cabin overflowed with mountain neighbors. The anniversary celebration apparently a community secret she hadn't been privy to. Speech. Someone called after gifts had been presented. Practical offerings like hand-knitted wool socks, canned specialties, a new axe handle. Clara shook her head, uncomfortable with the attention, despite months in a leadership role. Walter saved her with a raised glass of Peterson's potent moonshine. To Clara, he said simply, who came looking for a place to hide and instead found a place to stand. The gathering continued into evening, neighbors eventually departing in groups, headlights cutting through falling snow as vehicles carefully navigated the access road. Grace was last to leave, helping Clara clean up despite protests. "Not bad for someone who wanted nothing to do with people," Grace observed, drying the final dish. "I never said I wanted nothing to do with people," Clara corrected gently. "I just needed the right people." After Grace departed, Clara added a final log to the fire and opened her journal, not the original Walter had given her, which had been damaged during the vandalism, but a replacement with the same leather cover. Inside, she'd transcribed her previous entries alongside new observations. The anniversary entry began, 1 year on this mountain. The cabin is weather-tight, the garden dormant beneath snow, the community stronger than I could have imagined. Arrived carrying abandonment like a stone in my chest. Now I understand that belonging isn't something given to you by others. It's something you build, like a cabin, one careful piece at a time. Outside, snow continued falling, covering the tracks of those who had gathered to celebrate her presence among them. By morning, the mountain would appear untouched once more, a pristine beginning, built upon the solid foundation of what came before. The county meeting hall overflowed with attendees, forcing officials to open adjacent rooms where people watched proceedings via hastily arranged video feeds. 6 months of environmental studies, public comments, and legal maneuvering had culminated in this final hearing, the county commissioner's binding vote on Mountain View Development's revised proposal. Clara sat at the front table, designated for key speakers, Walter beside her, despite his doctor's recommendation to avoid stress. Grace arranged their documentation in meticulous order, while the Environmental Coalition's attorney reviewed last-minute strategy notes. Across the aisle, Mountain View's representatives projected corporate confidence, in their legal team's tailored suits contrasting with the practical attire of mountain residents. "They've modified the proposal significantly," the attorney whispered to Clara. "Reduced footprint, increased conservation easements. They're desperate to salvage something after all the negative publicity." Clara nodded. The vandalism of her cabin had backfired spectacularly for Mountain View, particularly after an investigative reporter linked the incident to a security contractor on the company's payroll. The resulting coverage had transformed a local zoning dispute into a regional environmental cause célèbre. The hearing proceeded with formal structure, opening statements, technical presentations, expert testimony. Mountain View's representatives emphasized economic benefits, job creation, and their newly demonstrated environmental sensitivity. Their revised plan preserved Clara's property entirely, along with most parcels containing endangered species habitat, a reasonable compromise, their spokesman concluded, balancing progress with preservation. When Clara's turn came to address the commissioners, she approached the podium with notes she'd hastily scribbled on hotel stationery that morning, her prepared remarks suddenly inadequate to the moment. "A year and a half ago, I bought a broken-down cabin site unseen," she began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I was running away, looking for any place remote enough that my pain couldn't find me. What I found instead was a mountain that healed me, and a community that taught me the difference between isolation and belonging." Clara gestured toward the maps, displayed on the wall, Mountain View's original proposal and their significantly reduced current version. We're asked to consider this revised plan as a reasonable compromise. But what's being compromised isn't negotiable. It's the fundamental character of a place that deserves protection, not because of endangered plants or historical significance, though these matter greatly, but because some places should remain as they are. She described the mountain through changing seasons, spring wildflowers emerging through melting snow, summer's abundant growth, autumn's spectacular colors, winter's austere beauty. She spoke of ecological connections revealed through university research on her property, how the lady's slippers depended on specific soil fungi, how wildlife corridors functioned, how water filtered through the mountain's complex systems. This isn't about property rights or economic development in isolation, Clara continued. It's about understanding that some values can't be measured in tax revenue or job statistics. As she concluded, Brad Mitchell from Mountain View approached with what appeared to be a spontaneous offer. Though Clara suspected it had been carefully prepared, "Miss Everfield," he said, voice pitched to carry throughout the room, "in the spirit of genuine compromise, Mountain View is prepared to exclude your property entirely from any development impact. A permanent conservation easement with compensation at twice market value. You could remain exactly as you are while the rest of the project proceeds with minimal disruption." A murmur rippled through the audience. The offer represented everything Clara had personally fought for: her cabin, her garden, her sanctuary preserved while still allowing her to claim victory. Clara felt Walter's steady gaze as she considered her response. The path that had brought her to this mountain, abandonment, foster care, searching for belonging, flashed through her mind. The memory of her first night in the cabin, alone except for Rusty, the community that had gradually embraced her. Walter's walking stick, now permanently in her possession by his insistence. "I appreciate the offer," Clara replied, choosing her words carefully. "But I didn't come to this podium speaking only for myself or my property. The mountain deserves protection as an interconnected whole, not as fragmented parcels based on who makes the loudest argument or presents the most compelling case." She turned back to the commissioners. "I was abandoned once as a child. I know what it means to be left behind, to be considered dispensable. I won't participate in abandoning this community or this ecosystem, even if it means my personal interests would be protected." The room fell silent as her words registered. Mountain View's representatives exchanged glances, their strategy unexpectedly derailed. Several commissioners shifted uncomfortably, their expressions suggesting Clara's refusal had disrupted political calculations. The final vote wouldn't come until evening. As the hearing recessed for lunch, Walter squeezed Clara's hand. "You did right," he said simply. "Whatever happens next." Outside the hall, Clara stepped into spring sunshine, the mountain visible in the distance, still snow-capped, eternally patient, waiting for the human deliberations to conclude. Whatever the outcome, she had found her voice, her place, her people. Some forms of belonging, once established, couldn't be lost to any vote or corporate maneuver. 2 years after Clara first arrived at the broken-down cabin, the mountain displayed its full summer splendor. Her garden, no longer just a small plot, but an expansive tapestry of vegetables, herbs, and flowers, hummed with bees harvested from Walter's hives. The cabin stood solid and welcoming, its renovations complete, its character enhanced rather than altered by Clara's careful stewardship. The wooden sign at the entrance to her property, hand-carved by Walter during his recovery, read simply, "Sanctuary." The word had multiple meanings now. A personal refuge, a protected habitat, a place of belonging. Clara sat on her porch swing, watching a young girl move cautiously through the garden rows, pointing excitedly at butterflies while maintaining careful distance from the plants as instructed. Rusty followed the child attentively, his muzzle now showing touches of grey, but his posture still alert and protective. "Emma, remember what we said about the tomato plants?" Clara called gently. "Look with your eyes, not your hands." They're still too fragile for touching. The girl nodded solemnly, clasping her hands behind her back with exaggerated care. At 9 years old, Emma carried the watchful demeanor of children who have learned early that the world can be unpredictable. Her social worker had contacted Clara 3 weeks ago, seeking temporary emergency placement in a rural setting where the child might recover from trauma too similar to Clara's own childhood experiences. Clara hadn't hesitated, though the prospect of responsible childcare had initially terrified her. The spare room, originally prepared for visiting researchers, had been quickly adapted with colorful bedding and a small bookshelf. Walter had appeared the following day with a hand-carved wooden fox that now stood sentinel on Emma's windowsill. "You've got more to offer than you realize," he'd said when Clara expressed doubt about her qualifications for caring for a wounded child. Sometimes healing happens best in places where others have healed too. The county commissioner's final vote had been closer than anyone expected, 3-2 in favor of the mountain community, establishing a conservation overlay that severely limited development across the entire region. Mountain View had appealed, of course, but the combination of endangered species protection, indigenous archaeological sites, and watershed concerns had created legal obstacles too substantial to easily overcome. More significant than the legal victory had been the transformation of the mountain community itself. What began as a defensive alliance had evolved into an ongoing collaborative stewardship. Clara's documentation of plant species expanded into a citizen science initiative. Walter's honey production grew into a cooperative supporting 6 local beekeepers. Grace established an education program bringing school groups to the mountain for ecological literacy experiences. The university's continued research presence had led to a small field station, constructed on communally donated land, a facility that brought modest economic benefits without disrupting the mountain's essential character. Clara occasionally provided housing for researchers, her cabin becoming a nexus for scientific work that further protected the ecosystem. "Clara," Emma called, interrupting her reflections. "Mr. Walter's coming up the path." Walter appeared around the bend, moving slower these days, but still covering his familiar route without complaint. Emma ran to meet him, Rusty at her heels, the child and dog having formed an immediate bond that helped bridge her initial wariness of this strange new place. "Brought something for our project," Walter told Emma, revealing seedlings nestled in small pots. "Apple trees. Special variety that does well at this elevation." Clara joined them as Walter explained to the wide-eyed child how they would plant the trees along the southern border of the property, a living legacy that would produce fruit long after those who planted them were gone. Emma listened with solemn attention, asking questions that revealed her growing understanding of the mountain's rhythms. Later, as the 3 of them worked together preparing holes for the seedlings, Clara felt a sense of completion, unlike anything she'd experienced before. The wounded woman who had fled to this mountain, seeking only isolation, could never have imagined this. Seen, her hands in the soil, alongside a child temporarily in her care and an elder who had become family by choice rather than blood, Emma carefully placed the first seedling into its prepared hole, her small fingers patting soil around its tender roots with innate gentleness. "Will it grow big enough for me to climb?" she asked Walter. "Not right away," he answered honestly. "Trees take patience. But someday, yes. I might not be here then," Emma said, her voice carrying the uncertainty of a child who had learned not to count on permanence. Clara knelt beside her, finding words that came from her own healed place. "You'll always have a connection to whatever you help plant and nurture, Emma. That doesn't disappear, even if you move on to other places." The girl considered this, then nodded with unexpected wisdom. "Like you in this cabin? You fixed it so it's always part of you now?" "Exactly like that," Clara confirmed, meeting Walter's knowing gaze over the child's head. From the porch, Rusty watched their work with contented vigilance, guardian of this evolving sanctuary where abandoned things and beings found renewal. where broken pieces were carefully mended, where roots could grow deep and strong in welcoming soil.